Good evening. I'm Mark Updegrove, the director of the Lyndon Baines Presidential Library and Museum. I want to welcome you here tonight. In what was perhaps the most important speech of his long political career, a plea to Congress to put into law voting rights in 1965, Lyndon Johnson began with the words, "I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I urge every member of both parties, Americans of all religions and all colors, from every section of this country, to join me in this cause." Nearly half a century after those words were spoken, we are honored to have in the library that bears Lyndon Johnson's name the 82nd Attorney General of the United States of America, Eric Holder. Attorney General Holder will speak tonight about the state of voting rights in America today, and will offer his view on how measures are being taken that threaten to suppress the rights that Lyndon Johnson and others worked to ensure in 1965. After the Attorney General's speech, he and I will have a conversation where we'll answer some of the questions that you submitted this evening. The Attorney General brings extensive legal experience to his current role. A native of New York City, Attorney General Holder is a graduate of Columbia College and Columbia Law School, and worked for the Department of Justice upon graduation as part of the Attorney General's Honors Program. In 1988, President Reagan named Mr. Holder as an associate judge of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. And in 1997, President Bill Clinton tapped him to become Deputy Attorney General of the United States. After going into private practice, Mr. Holder stepped back into public service shortly after President Obama tapped him to be the Attorney General in December, this time 3 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, good evening. And thank you, Mark Updegrove. It is a pleasure to be with you and to join so many friends, colleagues, and critical partners in welcoming some of our nation's most dedicated and effective civil rights champions, as well as the many University of Texas law students who are here and who will lead this work into the future. So for you UT folks, there we go, okay. I'd also, yeah, we can applaud, that's okay. I'd also like to thank Mark and his staff, as well as the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library and Museum's board members and community of supporters for providing a forum for today's conversation and for all that you do, not only to honor the life and legacy of our 36th Commander-in-Chief, but also to build upon his historic efforts to ensure the strength, the integrity, and the future of our democracy. Nearly half a century has passed since a national tragedy catapulted Lyndon Johnson to the presidency, and at the same time, launched a new chapter in America's story. Those of us who lived through those painful days will never forget LBJ's first presidential speech to a nation in mourning and in desperate need of strong and steady leadership. After quoting the 1961 inaugural address in which President Kennedy declared, most famously, "Let us begin," President Johnson outlined the unfinished business of the civil rights agenda. Then, with 3 simple words, he gave voice to the goals of his presidency and issued a challenge that has echoed through the ages. Let us continue. In fulfilling this directive, President Johnson and the many leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens who shared his vision and determination set our country on a course toward remarkable, once unimaginable progress. Together, they opened new doors of opportunity, helping to ensure equal access to schools and public spaces, to restaurants and workplaces, and perhaps most important of all, to the ballot box. Our great nation was transformed. In 1965, when President Johnson signed the landmark Voting Rights Act into law, he proclaimed, and I quote, "The right to vote is the basic right, without which all others are meaningless," unquote. Today, as Attorney General, I have the privilege and the solemn duty of enforcing this law and the other civil rights reforms that President Johnson championed. Now, this work is among the Justice Department's most important priorities, and our efforts honor the generations of Americans who have taken extraordinary risks and willingly confronted hatred, bias, and ignorance, as well as billy clubs and fire hoses, bullets and bombs, to ensure that their children and all American citizens would have the chance to participate in the work of their government. The right to vote is not only the cornerstone of our system of government, it is the lifeblood of our democracy. And no force has proved more powerful or more integral to the success of the great American experiment than efforts to expand the franchise. Now, despite this history, and despite our nation's long tradition of extending voting rights to non-property owners and women, to people of color and Native Americans, and to younger Americans, today a growing number of our fellow citizens are worried about the same disparities, divisions, and problems that nearly 5 decades ago LBJ devoted his presidency to addressing. In my travels across this country, I've heard a consistent drumbeat of concern from many Americans who, often for the first time in their lives, now have reason to believe that we are failing to live up to one of our nation's most noble and essential ideals. As Congressman John Lewis described it in a speech on the House floor this summer, the voting rights that he worked throughout his life and nearly gave his life to ensure are, and again I quote, under attack by a deliberate and systematic attempt to prevent millions of elderly voters, young voters, students, and minority and low-income voters from exercising their constitutional right to engage in the democratic process, unquote. Not only was he referring to the all-too-common deceptive practices that we've been fighting for years, he was echoing more recent concerns about some of the state-level voting law changes that we've seen this legislative season. Since January, more than a dozen states have advanced new voting measures. Now, some of these new laws are currently under review by the Justice Department, based on our obligations under the Voting Rights Act. Texas and South Carolina, for example, have enacted laws establishing new photo identification requirements that we are reviewing. We're also examining a number of changes that Florida has made to its electoral process, including changes to the procedures governing third-party voter registration organizations, as well as changes to early voting procedures, including the number of days in the early voting period. Now, although I cannot go into detail about the ongoing review of these and other state law changes, I can assure you that it will be thorough and it will be fair. We will examine the facts and we will apply the law. If a state passes a new voting law and it meets its burden of showing that the law is not discriminatory, we will follow the law and we will approve the change. And where a state cannot meet this burden, we will object as part of our obligation under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, as many of you know, and as I hope the law students here are learning, Section 5 was put in place decades ago because of a well-documented history of voter discrimination in all or parts of the 16 states to which it applies. Within these so-called covered jurisdictions, any proposed change in voting procedures or practices, from moving a polling location to enacting a statewide redistricting plan, must be pre-cleared, that is approved, either by the Justice Department or by a panel of federal judges. Now, without question, Section 5's pre-clearance process has been a powerful tool in combating discrimination for decades. In 2006, it was reauthorized with overwhelming bipartisan support, passing the House by a vote of 390 to 33 and the Senate by a vote of 98 to 0 before being signed into law by President Bush. Despite the long history of support for Section 5, this keystone of our voting rights laws is now being challenged 5 years after its reauthorization as unconstitutional in no fewer than 5 lawsuits. Each of these lawsuits claims that we have attained a new era of electoral equality, that America in 2011 has moved beyond the challenges of 1965, and that Section 5 is no longer necessary. I wish this were the case. The reality is that in jurisdictions across the country, both overt and subtle forms of discrimination remain all too common, and we don't have to look far to see recent proof. For example, in October, the Justice Department objected to a redistricting plan in East Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, where the map drawer began the process by meeting exclusively with white office holders and never consulted black office holders. The result was a map that diminished the electoral opportunity of African Americans. After the Justice Department objected, the parish enacted a new, non-discriminatory map. And here in Texas, just 2 months ago, the department argued in court filings that proposed redistricting plans for both the State House and the Texas congressional delegation are impermissible because the state has failed to show the absence of discrimination. The most recent census data indicated that Texas has gained more than 4 million new residents, the vast majority of whom are Hispanic, and that this growth allows for 4 new congressional seats. However, the state has proposed adding 0 additional seats in which Hispanics would have the electoral opportunity envisioned by the Voting Rights Act. Federal courts are still considering this matter, and we intend to argue vigorously at trial that this is precisely the kind of discrimination that Section 5 was intended to block. To those who argue that Section 5 is no longer necessary, these and other examples are proof that we still need this critical tool to combat discrimination and to safeguard the right to vote. As concerns about the protections of this right and the integrity of our election systems become an increasingly prominent part of our national dialogue, I think we must consider some important questions. It is time to ask, what kind of nation and what kind of people do we want to be? Are we willing to allow this era, our era, to be remembered as the age when our nation's proud tradition of expanding the franchise ended? Are we willing to allow this time, our time, to be recorded in history as the age when the long-held belief that in this country every citizen has the chance and the right to help shape their government became a relic of our past instead of a guidepost for our future? Well, for me and for our nation's Department of Justice, the answers are clear. We need election systems that are free from fraud, discrimination, and partisan influence, and that are more, not less, accessible to the citizens of this country. Under this administration, our Civil Rights Division and its voting section have taken meaningful steps to ensure integrity, independence, and transparency in our enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. We have worked successfully and comprehensively to protect the voting rights of U.S. service members and veterans, and to enforce other laws that protect Americans living abroad, citizens with disabilities, and language minorities. As part of our aggressive enforcement of the motor voter law, this year alone, we filed 2 statewide lawsuits to enforce the requirement that voter registration opportunities be made available at a wider variety of government offices beyond just the local Department of Motor Vehicles. And we're seeing promising results from this work. For example, after filing a lawsuit in Rhode Island, we reached an agreement with state agencies that resulted in more voters being registered in the first full month after our lawsuit than in the entire previous 2-year reporting period. We're also working to ensure that the protections for language minorities, including in the Voting Rights Act, are aggressively enforced. These protections now apply to more than 19 million voting-age citizens. These are our Spanish-speaking friends and neighbors, our Chinese-speaking friends and neighbors, and a large and growing part of all our communities. In just the past year, we filed 3 lawsuits to protect their rights. And today, we're actively reviewing nationwide compliance. But the Justice Department can't do it all. ensuring that every veteran, every senior, every college student, every eligible citizen has the right to vote must become our common cause. And for all Americans, protecting this right, ensuring meaningful access, and combating discrimination must be viewed not only as a legal issue, but as a moral imperative. Just as we recently saw in Maine, where voters last month overturned a legislative proposal to end same-day voter registration, the ability to shape our laws remains in the hands of the American people. Tonight, I'd like to highlight 3 areas where public support will be crucial in driving progress and in advancing much-needed reforms. The first involves deceptive election practices and dishonest efforts to prevent certain voters from casting their ballots. Now, over the years, we've seen all sorts of attempts to gain partisan advantage by keeping people away from the polls, from literacy tests and poll taxes to misinformation campaigns telling people that Election Day has been moved or that only one adult per household can cast a ballot. Before the 2004 elections, flyers were distributed in minority neighborhoods in Milwaukee, falsely claiming that, and I quote again, "If anybody in your family has ever been found guilty of a crime, you can't vote in the presidential election," unquote. And you risk a 10-year prison sentence if you do. 2 years later, 14,000 Latino voters in Orange County, California, received mailings warning in Spanish that, quote, "If you are an immigrant, voting in a federal election is a crime that can result in jail time," unquote. Both of these blatant falsehoods likely deterred some eligible citizens from going to the polls. And just last week, the campaign manager of a Maryland gubernatorial candidate was convicted on election fraud charges for approving anonymous robocalls that went out on Election Day last year to more than 100,000 voters in the state's 2 largest majority Black jurisdictions. These calls encouraged voters to stay home, telling them to, quote, "relax," because their preferred candidate had already wrapped up a victory. In an effort to deter and punish such harmful practices, during his first year in the United States Senate, President Obama introduced legislation that would establish tough criminal penalties for those who engage in fraudulent voting practices and would help to ensure that citizens have complete and accurate information about where and when to vote. Unfortunately, this proposal did not move forward, but I'm pleased to announce that tomorrow, Senator Charles Schumer and Ben Cardin will reintroduce this legislation in an even stronger form. I applaud their leadership, and I look forward to working with them as Congress considers this important legislation. The second area for reform is the need for neutrality in redistricting efforts. Districts should be drawn to promote fair and effective representation for all, not merely to undercut electoral competition and to protect incumbents. If we allow only those who hold elected office to select their constituents, instead of enabling voters to choose their representatives, the strength and legitimacy of our democracy will suffer. One final area for reform that merits our strongest support is the growing effort, which is already underway in several states, to modernize voter registration. Today, the single biggest barrier to voting in this country is our antiquated registration system. According to the Census Bureau, of the 75 million adult citizens who failed to vote in the last presidential election, 60 million of them were not registered and therefore not eligible to cast a ballot. All eligible citizens can and should be automatically registered to vote. The ability to vote is a right. It is not a privilege. Under our current system, many voters must follow cumbersome and needlessly complex voter registration rules. And every election season, state and local officials have to manually process a crush of new applications, most of them handwritten, leaving the system riddled with errors and too often creating chaos at the polls. But fortunately, modern technology provides a straightforward fix for these problems. If we have the political will to bring our election systems into the 21st century, it should be the government's responsibility to automatically register citizens to vote by compiling from databases that already exist a list of all eligible residents in each jurisdiction. Now, of course, these lists would be used solely to administer elections and would protect essential privacy rights. We must also address the fact that although 1 in 9 Americans move every year, their voter registration often does not move with them. Many would-be voters don't realize this until they miss the deadline for registering, which can fall a full month before Election Day. Election officials should work together to establish a program of permanent, portable registration so that voters who move can vote at their new polling place on Election Day. Until that happens, we should implement fail-safe procedures to correct voter roll errors and omissions by allowing every voter to cast a regular, non-provisional ballot on Election Day. Several states have already taken the step, and it's been shown to increase turnout by at least 3 to 5 percentage points. These modernization efforts would not only improve the integrity of our elections, they would also save precious taxpayer dollars. Now, despite these benefits, there will always be those who say that easing registration hurdles will only lead to voter fraud. Now, let me be clear. Voter fraud is not acceptable and will not be tolerated by this Justice Department. But as I learned early in my career as a prosecutor in the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section, where I actually investigated and prosecuted voting fraud cases, making voter registration easier is simply not likely by itself to make our elections more susceptible to fraud. Indeed, those on all sides of this debate have acknowledged that in-person voting fraud is uncommon. We must be honest about this, and we must recognize that our ability to ensure the strength and the integrity of our election systems and to advance the reforms necessary to achieve this depends on whether the American people are informed, engaged, and willing to demand common-sense solutions that make voting more accessible. Now, politicians may not readily alter the very systems under which they were elected. Only we, the people, can bring about meaningful change. So speak out. Raise awareness about what's at stake. Call on our political parties to resist the temptation to suppress certain votes in the hopes of attaining electoral success, and instead encourage and work with the parties to achieve this success by appealing to more voters, and urge policymakers at every level to reevaluate our election systems and to reform them in ways that encourage, not limit, participation. Today, we cannot and we must not take the right to vote for granted, nor can we shirk the sacred responsibility that has fallen upon our shoulders. Throughout his presidency, Lyndon Johnson frequently pointed out, and I quote, "America was the first nation in the history of the world to be founded with a purpose to right wrong and to do justice," unquote. Over the last 2 centuries, the fulfillment of this purpose has taken many forms: acts of protest and compassion, declarations of war and peace, and a range of efforts to make certain that, as another great president said, government of, by, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Today, there are competing visions about how our government should move forward. That's what the democratic process is all about: creating space for thoughtful debate, creating opportunity for citizens to voice their opinions, and ultimately letting the people chart their course. Our nation has worked and even fought to help people around the world establish such a process, most recently during the wave of civil rights uprisings known as the Arab Spring. Here at home, honoring our democracy demands that we remove any and all barriers to voting, a goal that all Americans of all political backgrounds must share. Despite so many decades of struggle, sacrifice, and achievement, we must remain ever vigilant in safeguarding our most basic and important right. Too many recent actions have the potential to reverse the progress that defines us and has made this nation exceptional, as well as an example for all the world. We must be true to the arc of America's history, which compels us to be more inclusive with regard to the franchise. And we must never forget the purpose that more than 2 centuries ago inspired our nation's founding and now must guide us forward. So let us act with optimism and without delay. Let us rise to the challenges and overcome the divisions of our time. Let us signal to the world that in America today, the pursuit of a more perfect union lives on. And in the spirit of Lyndon Baines Johnson, let us continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for those stirring remarks. You began the speech and you ended the speech with President Johnson's famous words, "Let us continue." And when he made that speech, he also pressed for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to be passed by a reluctant Congress. You were in your mid-teens or your early teens when you heard that speech. What was your reaction when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed?
Yeah, I was in my early teens. I was about 13 or so. And I don't think I fully understood the significance of what had occurred, though I knew it was important, certainly because my father told me that it was. But I did have a sense that there was something happening. I mean, I had the opportunity to view from New York City, where I was born and raised, all that was going on in the South at that time. Saw many of the leaders who were responsible for the change and the activity in the South standing behind the president as he was prepared to sign that important legislation, and understood that something significant, something transformative had actually occurred. It was interesting as we looked at the pictures here earlier. I noticed that one of the people behind the president as he was signing the legislation was my late sister-in-law, Vivian Malone, a young woman who in 1963 integrated the University of Alabama when George Wallace stood in the door. I had not realized that Vivian was there for that. And so on any number of levels, it was for me then something that I knew to be important, and as I said, transformative, and have come to realize over the years that it really changed what this nation was, and made it possible for a young black guy from Queens in New York to be the 82nd Attorney General of the United States of America.
Yeah. Note to the staff, we have to get the Attorney General a copy of that picture.
Or you'll have to deal with Sharon Malone, my wife.
When you were nominated to this post, you talked about one of your priorities being the reinvigoration of the Civil Rights Division. Why so? Why did you feel that in 2009?
Because the health of a United States Department of Justice, I think, can be measured by the vitality of its Civil Rights Division. Our division is led by a very capable, able, unbelievably energetic young guy named Tom Perez, and who's done a wonderful job. I thought that, quite frankly, the department had lost its way, that we had lost some of the spirit that moved President Johnson to against great political odds. And people have to understand that. What he did in getting the 64 Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, was really difficult, extremely, extremely difficult. He made unlikely allies. And that spirit needs to be a part of our Civil Rights Division. And I thought that we had kind of lost our way. And it seemed to me that as part of the legacy of this Justice Department, the Obama Justice Department, I wanted people 20, 30 years from now to look back and say, these were folks who cared about civil rights. They cared about making sure that this nation was true to its founding ideals. And that's the part of the Justice Department that has that responsibility, to make sure that we provide equal opportunity for people, that people are treated fairly, that we give everybody just a fair shake. And as I said, I'm proud of the work that's being done by our Civil Rights Division, though we have more work to do.
One of the things that seems to have changed, Mr. Attorney General, between the time when Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act and today is there's not a spirit of bipartisanship. There were members reaching across the aisle at that time to get things done, to move this country ahead. That spirit seems to be lacking in Washington today. You and I were talking backstage about the divisions that you see there. You've been in Washington since pre-Watergate, since 1973. Why have things become so divided in Washington?
That's an excellent question. I'm not sure I really have the answer. I've talked to people who served in Congress many years ago. One of the things they talk about is that Congress only sits now from Tuesday to Thursday, and then everybody goes home. That in the old days, people lived next to one another. They knew each other beyond just what happened on the floor of the Senate, the floor of the House. And it's hard to demonize somebody that you know. It's hard to demonize a person who is your neighbor. It's easier, I think, to interact with somebody who you know outside the workplace. So I think that's at least one of the reasons. There are other concerns I have with regard to, the extremes in parties leading parties in different directions. There is a notion, I think, that somehow or other you cannot be a person of principle if you compromise. And from my perspective, there is not a tension between those two. You can be a person of principle. You can have strong beliefs, and you can still compromise. It's how the best legislation that we've passed came about. And I hope that in the near future, and hopefully after the next election, if not before, that spirit will be rekindled. We have pressing problems in this country. We have urgent needs that have to be dealt with. And time is a wasting. So I would hope that the American people will keep this in mind as they exercise their right to vote next year and choose leaders, choose representatives who will have that spirit that Lyndon Johnson embodied and the men that he and women he worked with back in the 60s.
Do you see any hope of that divide being repaired after the election? Is there any reason for optimism?
I am always optimistic. My wife says I am ridiculously idealistic, but I could not live any other way. I mean, I think that given the magnitude of the issues that we confront, the seriousness of the problems that we have, that more than anything will make patriotic Americans, whether they be Democrats or Republicans, come together for the benefit of the people they represent, for the good of this country, and do so in a way that's consistent with our founding principles and consistent with the way in which people in Congress have conducted themselves for hundreds of years. So I remain optimistic.
Going back to the Voting Rights Act for a moment, the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized overwhelmingly by Congress in 2006 under George W. Bush's presidency. But 5 years later, the constitutionality of Section 5, which you mentioned in your speech, is being questioned. What is Section 5, and why do you believe it needs to be to remain intact?
Well, Section 5, as indicated in my speech, deals with 16 states or parts of 16 states where there has been a finding of a history of discrimination and where there is the need for a desire to make any kind of voting change. Pre-clearance has to happen either by the Justice Department or in the District Court in Washington, D.C. I'd like to be in a place where we could say that the need for Section 5 was not there anymore. But I think the reality, given some of the examples that I used in the speech and others that you can easily find, shows that discrimination, subtle forms, overt forms, still exists, and that there is a need for the continued vitality of the Voting Rights Act generally, Section 5 in particular, Section 2 as well. That these are tools that we need to have at the Justice Department, at this Justice Department, and successor Justice Departments, just as they were needed in Justice Departments before this one, to ensure that everyone has the right to the ballot, which I think is as President Johnson said, the most important right that we have. I mean, when you look at all that's going on in the world in the recent past, if you remember the people in Iraq holding up their thumbs, the purple mark on there, it was about them having the right to vote. The Arab Spring, well, again, all about the right to vote, to be a participant in the direction of your country. Most recently, I guess what we've seen in Russia, people demonstrating because they thought an election was conducted in a fraudulent way. This right to vote, this notion, this desire to be able to vote freely and without any kind of fraud or coercion is really kind of almost basic. And it's something that we have done well in the United States by constantly expanding the number of people who will have the opportunity to vote. And I'm concerned about some of the legislation that has been passed recently that goes against, as I call it, that arc of history, and it's tending to restrict in ways that are subtle and sometimes not so subtle the ability of the American people to cast their ballots.
while the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, so was the Immigration Act of 1965, which is many regard as the most sweeping immigration reform in the history of this country, and really fundamentally changed the face and the heart of this nation. There are a number of very tough anti-immigration measures that are being proposed throughout the country right now, most famously, I guess, in Arizona. And those measures are being challenged in the Supreme Court. The Obama administration opposes those tough anti-immigration measures. I'm wondering, why should, in your view, the Supreme Court strike them down?
Well, first, the regulation of immigration is something that is inherently a federal responsibility under our system of government. And if we were to allow the states to do this, we could have a patchwork of laws that would not handle this issue, I think, in an appropriate way. And I think we can never forget that we are a nation of immigrants. Whether you came over in the Mayflower or your descendants, or a slave ship, or part of the Great Migration of the early part of the 20th century, all of us, save Native Americans, trace our lineage to someplace else. We are all, at some point, immigrants. And that in some ways is both, that is the genius and the strength of this nation. It is through immigration that we revitalize our nation. We bring new people in with different ideas, different thoughts. It has always made this nation stronger. It is an advantage that we have against other nations who are our competitors in the 21st century. And so we can't turn our back on this immigrant past that has made this nation great, and we certainly cannot allow the states to do that which the federal government has always had the responsibility. That is an argument, obviously, that the Supreme Court will ultimately have to decide, but I think the law is on our side, and I think history has put its arm around the position that we will take.
You have a very big job at a very eventful time. What is your biggest priority when you wake up every day? What is your top priority?
I think that probably the whole question of national security. I come back to the Justice Department, having been there last during the 90s when I was Deputy Attorney General in the Clinton administration, to a Justice Department that's fundamentally different. We have new national security responsibilities that did not exist in that Justice Department from before, which was a pre-9/11 Justice Department. I sit down every day at 8:30 with the FBI director, and we are briefed on the threat stream for the past 24 hours. And it is a very sobering thing. Whatever my mood is, when I get up in the morning, by the time that 8:30 meeting is over, I'm usually not in a good mood. When I hear about all the threats and plots and people who are trying to do things to people here in the United States or against American interests around the world. So that is the thing that keeps me awake. It is the thing that consumes the vast majority of my time. But one of the things I wanted to do when I became Attorney General was not to, although we have to spend huge amounts of time on national security, was not to forget what I've come to call the traditional mission of the department. The Justice Department has a unique responsibility in other areas when it comes to civil rights, the environment, antitrust. And I wanted to make sure that in those areas, while we're still fulfilling our national security obligations, that we would also continue to make sure that we had a vigorous and aggressive Justice Department in those other areas as well. And I'm proud of the men and women in those other areas who I think are doing a great job.
You had obviously seen this job up close as deputy, but what most surprised you about this role when you actually undertook it?
Well, this is going to sound funny, but maybe funny. People actually listen to the Attorney General.
You got about 800 of them right there.
When you're Deputy Attorney General, I can give speeches all over the place and get picked up, maybe not picked up. When you're the Attorney General of the United States, whatever you say tends to get scrutinized, tends to get reported, and if you're not careful, tends to get you in trouble. So that's something that really it's taken a little time to get used to, but it's also made me understand that I have the ability to raise issues and to bring things to the consciousness of the nation. And that is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about the whole question of voting rights here at the LBJ Library, the best venue in the world to talk about this particular issue and to hopefully generate some conversation about this, to make people aware of the problems that I have detailed, and to put, I think, this country on a course that Lyndon Johnson set, so that we don't think of ways in which we exclude people from having the right to vote, but expand, always expand, in an appropriate way, expand the way in which people will have the right to cast their ballots.
I've got some questions here from our audience members tonight. We know that this is not the time for levity. However, do you think President Gingrich will reappoint you? That's a real question.
All righty. There are, as I frequently say in Congress in response to the friendly questioning that I'm often subjected to there, I will disagree with the premise of that question. But were it to occur, I think you could take to the bank that I would not be President Gingrich's Attorney General.
A quick answer to that question. What is the fate of the Defense of Marriage Act in 2012?
Well, this is ultimately something I think that the Supreme Court will decide. We made the determination when confronted with a unique situation that we found in the Second Circuit that had not passed on the constitutionality of DOMA, that we had to make the determination as to what standard should be applied. And given the history of discrimination that gays and lesbians have had to endure in our nation, we thought a heightened scrutiny test was appropriate and did not feel that DOMA passed that test. And on that basis, we indicated that we would not defend the constitutionality of the act, something that Justice Departments rarely do, though prior Justice Departments, Republican as well as Democratic, have done. We have since indicated to courts where we had previously taken a position that we would defend the act, that we no longer will defend it. This is something that, as I said, the Supreme Court will ultimately decide. But I think that given where we are in 2011, and given the history that we've had, that DOMA simply does not pass constitutional muster, that we are in a fundamentally different place, and but again, it will be for the Supreme Court to decide.
Right. I'm reading this verbatim. Often in discussions of voter suppression, the impact on voters with disabilities is overlooked. What is DOJ doing to ensure that individuals with disabilities have equal access to the ballot?
Well, that is really an integral part of our voting rights effort. We have a voting rights section that focuses on all of the things that we are supposed to follow. It is not simply about race, not simply about gender, ethnicity. The questioner is right. We also have to make sure that there are not physical limitations, physical things that prevent all Americans, whatever their physical capacities, from exercising their right to vote. And that is something that we work on. We work with states to try to make sure that voting places are accessible, and to the extent that they are not, we bring suits. We challenge them. We make sure that that is the case. It is, as I said, an integral part of the work that we do.
Right. Will you be honoring Congressman Nadler's request to investigate recent police harassment and brutality against various people across the country?
Yeah, we have, I think, Tom Perez, we just did something earlier. We have, I think, a record number of what we call pattern or practice investigations presently underway in our Civil Rights Division. It looks at the way in which police departments are conducting themselves in interacting with the citizens that they serve. I think we need about 11 or 16, I don't know the exact number, of these investigations presently underway in New Orleans, in Puerto Rico, other jurisdictions. And we take, again, this very seriously. And what I think our Civil Rights Division has done this time around, and different from the way I think it's been done in the past, is to be more collaborative as we approach jurisdictions where these investigations are underway. Work with the elected leadership there, work with the communities that raise these concerns. I work with the police departments, and as a result of that, as Tom was indicating, we actually are now getting requests from jurisdictions for us to come in and to help them come up with ways in which we can help them deal with the issues that separate their police departments from the communities that they are supposed to serve. And this ultimately has an impact on law enforcement. If you have communities that do not believe in their police departments, they are less likely to provide evidence, less likely to help police departments, and that ultimately serves as a deterrent to good law enforcement.
You talked earlier about the sobering security briefs that you get every morning. What can you tell us about our fight against terrorism in this country and your efforts to stem the tide on those who would do us harm?
Well, I think that we need to be wary that there are people and organizations out there who would still want to do America harm. But you should also be reassured by the fact that there are hundreds, thousands of men and women who stay up later than I do, who work long, unbelievably long hours with little recognition, monitoring, gathering intelligence, formulating plans, disrupting plots that people never hear about. That we have a good apparatus in place that is designed to detect, disrupt, interfere with those who would do our nation harm. We have a president who focuses on this, spends every Tuesday with his national security team, bringing us all together, in addition to the things that he does on a daily basis. He brings us all together as a team on Tuesday afternoons to talk about the threat environment. But we have to be wary. We have seen a transformation of the nature of the threat from Al-Qaeda at its core to what we've come to call these lone wolves, people who, for whatever reason, have become radicalized and are determined to do harm to the country. Either they come here on airplanes with bombs in their underpants, or they are people who would blow up a car in Times Square, people who act as individuals. And it's a very difficult thing to keep track of those people, to prevent them from engaging in these negative acts. But we have, again, mechanisms in place that I think monitor people in a way that's consistent with our Bill of Rights. But that's one of the things that I think that really concerns me, and I know concerns other members of the national security team. How do we deal with these individuals, these lone wolves?
Is the problem, is the world problem getting better or worse? Are we making marked improvements, or do you see it getting worse?
I actually think things are getting better. I think that we've certainly, with the use of our military, been very successful in removing from the field, I think as the president described it, that's the term that he used a couple of days ago, removing from the field people like bin Laden, Alaki, people who were charismatic and who were leaders and inspired others to do harm to the United States. I think that the move to democracy in the Middle East is something that can only be can be a positive if the transformation happens in a way that respects individual rights, individual liberties. If voting is something that is seen as a core principle in these new regimes. So I think I'm actually optimistic about where we are. I think we're in a better place than we were immediately after September the 11th and in the years following September the 11th, but we can't let our guard down. The reality is that there are still organizations there, still people there, new organizations being formed, new people being radicalized, so we have to keep our guard up against them.
There are a number of folks who are concerned about redistricting efforts here in the state of Texas, and indeed throughout the country. There are gerrymandering efforts afoot. Talk about your view of redistricting, if you would, Mr. Attorney General, and what your concerns regarding the changing of congressional districts are.
Well, it is a political process. The Supreme Court has said that. But that does not, in my view, excuse the creation of districts or the drawing of lines that are inconsistent with the Voting Rights Act, which is why we have brought suit where we have, or where we do things that are inconsistent with who we say we are as a nation, who we say we are as a people. Sometimes I think people have to be bigger, our elected leaders have to be bigger than they have been, and have battles with the other side about ideas, but do so in a way and in front of an electorate that is fairly drawn, not districts that are designed only to reelect incumbents, not districts that are drawn in a way that's inconsistent with the Voting Rights Act and that would exclude people of color, minorities from having electoral opportunities that the Voting Rights Act clearly says they should have. Don't try to frustrate the aims of the act. Compete for those votes. Engage in a battle of ideas, policies, programs, and see if you can win votes that way, as opposed to trying to figure out ways in which you deny people the right to cast their ballots.
Gerrymandering, though, seems to be a long-standing tradition in American politics. How is this different from gerrymandering efforts of yesteryear?
Well, I mean, gerrymandering, so that, to the extent that you're drawing things, again, I say that that's legal. When it's a political process, sure. When you're doing gerrymandering with these kind of, weird districts and you're doing it for political reasons, that's one thing. But when when you put into the mix the notion that you are trying to deny a certain minority group, an ethnic group, an opportunity, an electoral opportunity to pick the representative of their choice, that's fundamentally different. That is simply unacceptable. That is something that this Justice Department, as long as I have the honor of leading it, will aggressively fight. We'll file suits where we have to. We will stay up late to file the best briefs that we can. And we will monitor situations around the country as new laws are passed to make sure that these laws are in conformity with the Voting Rights Act. We have a great many important responsibilities in the Department of Justice. Among them, and maybe chief among them, is this responsibility to make sure that every American citizen has the right to vote in the way that our laws say, in the way in which our Constitution would dictate, and as I've said on more than one occasion, in conformity with the ideals that have made this nation great.
I have one more question that was written by one of our audience. How aggressively will the DOJ enforce Section 5 of the Voting Rights in spite of attempts to attack I'm afraid I'm lost there.
Constitutionality?
I think that it's illegible, but something along those lines, yeah.
Yeah.
You'll have to improve your writing skills.
Well, let me be very, very clear. Section 5 is alive, and it's well. It is a tool that we have used, that we intend to use. Whatever the attacks, constitutional attacks that have been brought or being brought against it, we will stand up for Section 5 in whatever court we have to. We will use that tool to make real the promise of the act that Lyndon Johnson signed, over 50 years or so ago. Section 5 must remain a part of the America that is real, not an America that we can imagine. As I said in my remarks, I wish that there were no need for Section 5 enforcement. And yet, we have seen time and again instances of discrimination, instances where people have been denied the fair access to the ballot on the basis of the color of their skin, their ethnicity, their income level, all things that are inconsistent with the American ideal. I have to worry about national security. It is what I wake up to do. It is probably the last thing I think about before I go to sleep. But there's a lot of time in between those things. And during every day, I also think about, what are we doing on the civil rights front? What are we doing to make real the promises that made me Attorney General? Without the inspired leadership of Lyndon Johnson, John Kennedy, and all that they were able to do during that tumultuous but very productive decade. I have, I think, a unique responsibility. It's a responsibility that I feel in my core to make sure that my time as Attorney General pays honor to the sacrifices of men and women in the South, other parts of our country, that does right by President Johnson, does right by President Kennedy. And it makes, I think, at the end of the day, this country better than it was, and makes it all that it possibly can be.
Mr. Attorney General, you honor this institution and the legacy of President Johnson by being here tonight, and we wish you all the very best in the important work that you're doing, and thank you for your thoughts tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Enjoyed this a lot.